So my guest today is none other than Mike Clelland, who is just an awesome guy who we're just talking about. We've known each other for a long time, and Mike has gone on to do just some amazing, amazing things. Very excited for what he's done. And it all centers around this idea of owls and UFOs. And he's written a couple of very well-received books that have really changed the landscape of not just ufology, although I hate that term, but in general, the whole idea of what this extended consciousness experience contact thing that people are having, how that might tie into these things that we're seeing in the sky, and just a whole lot more. So Mike is our guest. Let's get him on the screen. Mike, thanks so much for joining me.
It's my honor. It's delightful to be here.
Well, I don't know about honor. That might be a little bit too much. So give people the general rundown. We're going to be talking about it from a bunch of different angles, but a little bit of timeline, chronology, who you are, how this thing unfolded, and what you do.
Ooh, okay. So 12 years ago, I was leading this completely different life. I was working for an outdoor school. I was living out west. I had these experiences in my youth that sound just like UFO contact. Missing time, seeing aliens out my window in the yard, seeing UFOs, and a handful of other things. But there was a few core memories that I had, and I wasn't going to go there. I wasn't going to look at them. I wasn't going to deal with them. I could talk about them. I could tell them about them in like around the campfire, around the dinner table or something. Like, here's an interesting story. And I'd tell a story, and then I would go, isn't that interesting? I wouldn't go beyond that. And I knew there was this little simmering fire in there. So I had been working as an illustrator. I had been doing some outdoor work, teaching in the mountains, and I had been doing cartoon work for some instructional books on skiing and backpacking and such. Now, went camping for one night. And 12 years ago.
Hold on, because that story is the camping story is an amazing story. I know you've told it many times, but I'm going to ask you to kind of tell it again in a minute. But I think the other interesting thing, and I don't want to kind of push you into anything that you're too uncomfortable talking about.
At this point, I've you're going to have to try hard to get me to, unless I give. So.
No, I was going to say you're a super open guy, and I really, really, really respect your vulnerability around this topic. And I think it's been such a tremendous gift for a lot of people, for you to be so open and to be so vulnerable. And I guess what I'm alluding to is your life wasn't exactly clicking in a lot of ways. So I love how you say, I was there at the dinner table, Thanksgiving table, talking about this stuff. But deep down, I was hurting in some ways that I couldn't quite figure out, couldn't quite connect. And do you want to speak to that at all?
So I suffered from severe clinical depression. For the first bout was when I was 12 years old. I remember it, and it was debilitating. And I have no problem talking about this. I've talked about it with other folks, and people have invited me on podcasts to talk about my history of depression. So it was brutal, debilitating in 1992, 93. I would have been 30 years old. I'm 55 now. I'll be 56 in 2 weeks. So I had that, and it would go. I went in and out. I worked with medications. I worked with therapy. Surprisingly, 4 years ago, I did a past life regression and went and examined a past life, and this traumatic event in my past life kind of revealed itself. We don't need to go into it, but I don't know if it's real. I don't know. I was presented with this kind of collection of little snapshots, and I sat up in the chair after the session was over, and I was like, I'm cured. And I haven't been depressed in any kind of meaningful way since then. So I don't know whether I'm cured or not, but so I have a history of depression, and that and at the outdoor work and being outside and the physical aspect of all that stuff was surprisingly therapeutic too. So I think I migrated to that specifically for the therapeutic quality of being outside and doing all the hard physical work.
Let me jump in there for a minute because you just threw a curveball
I
at
knew
me.
I was, how else could yeah, so.
Hey man, I appreciate it. I love curveballs. I mean, that's what I think. Like I said, this truth bump thing, that's what it's about to me, is not being scripted, not knowing where you're going to go because we don't know where
Yeah.
we're going. I mean, that is really your story in the broader sense, is being open to kind of following these different paths. But I digress, because here's the curveball you throw me, is past life regression somehow unlocks a key for depression. Man, we've heard that before. I've heard that too many times to dismiss it. But the other story I've heard is abduction experiences, repressed, unexamined, can also contribute to depression. Have you, how do you put those two together?
Well, I met with Bud Hopkins and other therapists, and I'll tell you, you sit across the. I mean, I've met with actually some. I met with Bud and Leo Sprinkle and Dave Jacobs, and I was doing a lot of just sort of research. I was reaching out to these people. I wanted to just talk to them. I wanted to talk to as many people as I could. So yes, the my history of depression. I want to be very cautious. Say that I can't trace that back to UFO contact because it runs in my family also. And if you talk to someone like Dave Jacobs, he would say that, but UFO contact runs in family.
Mike, I kind of interrupted you in your telling of this.
Oh, because I had to jump to the past life thing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and cool stuff. But back to this story, your camping story, it's just purely amazing, and it's so human, personal kind of thing. Please tell people.
It was 12 years ago, 2006. I was living out west, and I was at the time doing a lot of camping and such. The little town, the community I lived in is full of, crunchy hippies that were out camping all the time. So I met someone. I said, let's go out for one night. She said, sure. This was not unusual in that kind of culture. And so we went out for one night, and it was a beautiful night and calm. We didn't take any tent. Just we're going to sleep under the stars. We went high in the mountains. We're sitting on a big flat rock. I'm making dinner on a little camp stove, and her name is Kristen. And she said something, and I was like, I'm impressed. She just said something. I was like, wow, wait a minute. I did not expect that to come out of you. And I really couldn't remember what it was at the time, but right in that moment, an owl flew over, and then a second owl, and then a third owl. And for the next couple of hours, as the sun set and the stars came out, we were watching these three owls. It was on, you'd lie flat on your back, and you'd look up at the stars, beautiful Rocky Mountain high elevation environment. And these owls would just whoosh, swoop over you, and the stars would be blotted out for 1 second. It was completely silent. It was magical. And we had this cool night out. And then a couple of days later, I said, let's do this one more time. She said, great. So 4 days later, we went out and we did the same thing. We went to a different spot in the mountains for one night, and it was a little colder. So that night, we had a shelter. We had a tent with us that night. And we said, let's walk up to that hilltop and warm up because it's kind of cold. So we walked up to the hilltop, and we get to the top of the hill and watch the sunset. And an owl lands on a branch near us, and an owl swoops above us, and an owl lands on the ground by us. And for the next 45 minutes or so, these owls are right there in the moment. And before they kept their distance a little bit. Not this time. They were on the branches right next to us. They were on the ground right in front of us. And to have it happen once was pretty cool, but to have it happen twice was kind of freaked me out. And I didn't say this at the time, but I'm saying it now, and I'm saying it in the books. When I saw those owls 2 nights in a row, real owls, right up close with someone else, I had this booming thought in my head. It could have been an external voice. It felt like it was my own voice, and it said, this has something to do with the UFOs. Started a blog. Eventually I started looking into the stuff. I started looking into the owl stuff. I started looking into the UFO stuff. I started looking into my own story. And at one point I started the blog, and that was the very first post on the blog, the story I just told about these owls. And after I posted it, I got a hold of Kristen, and I said, what were we talking about that first night when you first saw the owls? And she said, I remember exactly what we were talking about. I was giving my most heartfelt definition of what God means to me. And I was like, so that one small detail is so important in this thing. And I'm not at all churchy or anything like that, but it had a kind of a resonant power that I couldn't ignore. And so that started me. And then from that point on, I just was like, I was all about owls. And everyone I asked in the UFO community, I would ask the same question: have you ever had any odd experiences with owls? It's not 100%, but enough people were saying, well, here's a funny story for you. Then I started writing these stories down. I started collecting them. I started archiving them. And that became one big fat book, and it became a second big fat book.
So I just popped up on the screen there, my kind of first truth bump, and that's anyone can go and Google owls UFOs. And it's all Mike Clelland. When you do that, it's all Mike Clelland. So I wanted to talk about your impact from a couple of different perspectives. One perspective is just, how do you explain it? How do you explain being this guy who's out camping and taps into something that is so deeply profound for so many people and has largely been, I don't want to say, it just has been left unexplored for the most part, undiscovered by all these people who are interested in the connection between consciousness and UFOs. So that's number one. And then number two is, what do you make of, what do you take in terms of your responsibility? I mean, that's a weighty kind of thing to have, to be that guy now, that this thing is so significant for so many people. So can you pull those two apart for me?
So the first question was, the second part is my responsibility. The first question is like, why was this left untapped? So
and how, why was it left untapped? Of course. Why do you suppose you were the one chosen to tap into it? Or do you believe that you were the one chosen to tap into it? Or what are your thoughts around that? I mean, owls in Google, owls UFO, bam, there's one guy. You're the guy.
Yes. So I have pondered, I have no proof of this. I have a missing time event in 1974. Did they take me to, so I don't have any memories of being on board a UFO, but all the stuff around it sure seems like did they like zap me? Did they like sit me down in some sort of altered state and say, you in 45 years, you will be the guy who answers 5 emails a day about owls? That was long before, and so if you will, so I've wondered that, and it feels like that. I have no proof of it, but it kind of feels like that. My life was going one way and boom, it just shot off in a different direction. And now I am stuck with this, and I have to say, it is so wildly rewarding, right? It is so fun to have this small little niche. It's like, I keep on thinking like the high school history teacher, if the student came up and said, I'm going to write a report on World War II, the history teacher would say, ooh, let's rein that in a little bit. And so you would kind of go from, the Pacific to an island, to one guy, to one boat, to one story, to one afternoon, and then you write your report. And that's what it feels like to me. It's like, well, golly, I could write a book about UFOs, and like, oh, don't go down that road, because but this tiny little fractal has been so rewarding. And it was out there so that you could, and I looked and I found a lot of them. And there's in a lot of books, there's a paragraph or two about owls.
Well, that's kind of the point. It was out there, but it wasn't out there. So
it was whispered, and it had and that was mostly the what would be referred to as the screen memory aspect of the owls, which is a part of the UFO abduction research, but it is a small part of it. But it is the more interesting thing to me is the people who are seeing real owls in these moments. That to me is remarkable.
But so, Mike, let's jump into that in a different way. You, in addition to publishing these excellent books, have also published an audio version of Stories from the Messengers. And it's very well done. It's just great. And it's your voice, which I think is always so cool when an author records their own book, because it brings so much more to it. And I wanted to play people a clip from your excellent sample for 2 reasons. One, so that they can see how cool it is. But number 2, it really gets at this larger question, the question that really I care about, and I think you care about deeply, is that what are owls? How are we supposed to understand them? You talk about them being a totem. You talk about them being a screen memory. That's just a UFO disguised as an owl. There's so many ways to pull that apart. Let me play this clip into the show so people can hear it, and then let's talk about it.
This is a book of remarkable real-life experiences. This is also a book about owls. Owls seem to play a shadowy role in the UFO contact experience. They also show up in relation to highly charged events like synchronicities, ancient archetypes, dreams, shamanic initiation, magic, psychedelic hallucinations, spiritual transformation, and death. I explored the owl and its connection with these divergent ideas in The Messengers, my first book on UFOs. That book was also my own story of how owls played a role in my life. It was an exploration into the deeply personal questions that arose from my contact experiences. The process of creation was a journey of transformation, and I was a different person when the book was completed. Within the nearly 400 pages of The Messengers, I repeatedly asked, why owls? The question is simple. The answer is not. The owl is a symbol. It's much more than just a bird with big eyes. It represents something in the darkness, just beyond what we know in our conscious minds. It's a red flag forcing me to pay attention, a clue to look deeper. Many people have told me that they've had an owl experience that is somehow tied into a spiritual awakening. It's a call to wake up, to pay attention, and to look within. The owl is telling us to confront the deepest part of ourselves. It's a summons to transform our soul. After immersing myself so deeply in this subject, I am now at the point where I see owls and UFOs as the same thing. Both are eerily silent in flight, and both have the power to change people's lives. The act of writing The Messengers was monumental. At its core, that book was just a collection of stories. The challenge was how to convey the elusive quality of what people had shared with me. I am proud of the ideas that unfolded in that book, yet at the same time it was heartbreaking to have to edit down so many amazing stories in a way that would serve the reader. There were accounts that had such a powerful scope, but it was impossible to fit those in the manuscript. This follow-up book is meant to be a companion, a place that allows for these important stories to be told more completely. Each chapter in this book focuses on a personal experience, and these accounts have two things in common: an owl and a UFO.
Talk to the clip in terms of the different. I love the way you break it down. Owls is a totem, owls is a archetype, owls is a, how did you come to that? And just, that is the overall message. Just speak to that a little bit, because it's really deep. It's really deep in a lot of ways.
So I was, Rich Dolan gave me a hard time because he was like, you need to be able to answer that. People ask, what do owls mean? And the honest answer is, I don't know. But he was like, no, you got to be able to answer that. So
I had to jump in there because I didn't really tee that up quite correctly. I mean, you have these books where you've collected hundreds, at this point, thousands of stories from people who have strange encounters with owls and associated with UFOs a lot of times, but not all the time. I mean, some are shamanic journeys, some are dreams, out-of-body experiences. All that you just opened up and said, tell me about your strange experiences with owls. And you start getting back all this stuff, and you're relating it to your own UFO contact experience, which you're not even sure is a UFO contact experience, but you're trying to pull all this stuff together. And now the benefit of doing that is you've kind of sorted and sifted and said, okay, I have these different categories that I need to consider, because as they're being reported to me, here's what people are saying it is. So maybe start with that. What are the basic categories that people report? And then how do you, synthesize that? What are your thoughts about that?
So, I mean, right off on when I've worked, one small box is a UFO box. That box is pretty full for me. The other boxes are a little less full: death, shamanic initiation, mushrooms, meditation, and
Out-of-body experience. Yeah.
And dreams too. So those I have like a smaller number of those stories that I've collected. I got a lot of UFO stories, so that box is full. Now we split that box into two boxes, and one is the screen memory, and the other is people seeing real owls. Right?
So explain for folks screen memory as we understand it, because even
this is a slippery. So it's like every element is like slipping out of your hand, and you can't hold on to it. And so so the screen memory would be someone's driving, and I got this one over and over again. I got it just yesterday, and someone's driving home at night. There's an owl in the road. I was like, "Wow, that's a big owl." And sometimes they pull up to the owl, sometimes they drive around the owl, and sometimes they actually get out and look at the owl. And then they drive home, and then they get home and they're 2 hours late. It's like, what happened? Why? I should have been home at midnight. It's 2 a.m. And then at some point, perhaps they go through hypnotic regression, and the hypnotherapist says, describe the owl. And they'll say, well, the owl is skinny and about 4 feet tall and has a bald head and big black eyes. It's wearing a tight-fitting spacesuit, and I don't think it's an owl. So the implication is that there is a psychic projection, that the observer is seeing an owl, and that's what they remember, and that has been somehow put in through some sort of hypnosis, who knows why, some technology, whether it's psychic energy or a technology, I don't know, but people are left remembering it's an owl. Now, it's not just owls. There's deer and raccoons and clowns and big squirrels and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that show up in the screen memory aspect, but far and away the number one on the list is owls. Right behind that is deer. Both of these are highly charged symbolic animals of mythology too. So that's the screen memory. That's off to one side. Yeah.
And the other thing, like we were just alluding to not go too far into inside baseball without bringing people along, is the slippery slope on screen memories. I mean, the whole thing, like you said, is slippery, because as soon as you start talking about hypnotic regression, now I remember this, people are jumping off and going, well, you can't trust hypnosis and all the rest of that, which you can, and of course we can, and it's used in forensically courts and that, and some places it's admissible, but also take all that and put that in a box over on the side, since you're using the box thing. But the other thing that makes it slippery is now we start interpreting other people's accounts and overlaying that, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the problem area gets to be people go, oh, well, that's a screen memory. Well, I don't know that it's a screen memory. I just had this experience. So one guy says, yeah, I had a hypnotic regression, and I've come to understand it as a screen memory. But someone else just has a memory, and they don't know. They're not at the point of saying it's a screen memory. And a lot of times, researchers or other folks want to jump in there and say, oh, well, that's a screen memory. Well, we don't know that it's a screen memory, because then we're going to go further along this continuum. You're going to talk about quote unquote real owls, whatever the hell that means. And then we're going to talk about owls in some kind of dream state, or, so we don't know it. So the whole thing is just very, very hard to pin down. But rather than just throw up our hands and say, oh yeah, it's impossible to understand, and it's all, I mean, I want to try and nail it down a little bit like you just did. So I would bring you back to this very fine point, but it's maybe something we can contribute to this overall conversation. And that's, what do you think about people who are kind of quick to judge other people's experience as being this screen memory?
Well, I'm certain there are screen memories. Some play out as screen memories, and I can, I want to be, like I.
Right. Given some are
4 foot tall, the 4 foot tall owl in the middle of the road and driving at night and missing time. You can put all those puzzle pieces together, and it implies something. So it may, who knows what the deeper reality underlying all that is. And I had the conversation with Dave Jacobs. I called him up on the phone, and you could just hear him. Oh, you could hear him backpedaling, and you could hear his toes curling in his shoes as I gave my rendition of all this. And he was basically, oh, they're all screen memories. If someone sees an owl, it's a screen memory. And I was like, in many cases, I'll give you that, but not in all of them. So on the other side is these real owls. And people are seeing real owls. I had someone contact me, and they said, well, how come people don't take pictures of these real owls? And I'm like, well, actually, I do. And the problem is they're cell phone pictures, and they're crappy, and they look, some little owl off on a branch. There's not much to see. And you can kind of, if you really, so I don't really post them, because there's kind of lousy pictures. There's a couple in the book of people who saw real owls right in the moment.
But I guess what I'm hung up on, and I'm going to just pull this thread a little bit further and then let it go because you're living it, but it's fun to get your opinion. Isn't it very tricky territory when we start talking about real owls? Because when we do enter into the shamanic kind of part, the spiritual kind of part, the extended consciousness dimensions, where we're also running into beings that shape shift and all the rest of that, it's just really hard to pin down. And I appreciate David Jacobs, and he's been on the show a couple times. We had some really interesting discussions. But I see that as problematic to say it's in one hand helpful to say we have to really embrace the technological part, the consciousness tricks, engineering, technology that is causing us to communicate telepathically, to have our memory erased, to maybe even transport our consciousness. I'm all about nailing that down, but at the same time, I want to balance that with this deeper understanding of fully embracing the shamanic part of it in a way that makes sense. And I know you're all about this, so
there comes a point when you put your UFO researcher hat on, right? Your says UFO researcher on the hat, and someone gives you a story, and they say some really weird thing about owls, and you kind of, as a nuts and bolts UFO researcher, maybe you pay attention to it, but eventually you kind of have to push that report aside. Now, if you take that hat off and put on your shaman hat instead and say, oh, I'm going to look at this as a shamanic experience, everything opens up. In my opinion, like it all opens up, and I'm not a shaman or anything like that, but the questions I ask of people, are what was going on in your life just before you saw the owl or the UFO? I at this point, they're equal to me. Owls and UFOs, obviously, are not the same thing, but I treat them as the same thing. So someone has a powerful owl experience. What was going on in your life right before you saw the owl? Someone has a powerful UFO experience. What was going on in your life right before? What changed afterwards? And I really pay attention to those answers, and that to me is where the fascinating stuff shows up. And what's very common is I got a lot of accounts of people walking through the woods, and they say, wouldn't it be interesting right now to hear an owl? And boom, an owl starts hooting right next to him. And I've had the same thing happen where people say, wouldn't it be interesting to see a UFO? And then boom, there's a hovering craft right above them. So that's common in both sides of this weird equation.
Well, that leads right into this next point that I wanted to talk about. And I pulled a short clip from an interview you gave with Jim Harold on the Paranormal Podcast too. Thanks for pointing me to this interview, because it reminded me of what a great job Jim Harold does. And he does a very straight up kind of radio style thing. But in listening to his interview with you, I was really impressed that he was hitting on a lot of the deeper questions that I wanted to talk about and doing it in an excellent way. Let me play this clip and then we can talk about it.
To make. And it might be part of it, but it all crumbles when you start to really look at the weirdness that surrounds it. So this is what I often say in this research is I need to take my UFO researcher hat off and put on my shaman hat. Like I have to ask the questions a shaman would ask. What was going on in your life leading up to the event? What changed in your life after the event? So if we were in like a young tribesman and you came to the shaman's teepee at the edge of the village, 500 years ago in North Dakota, and you had seen an owl under, let's say, highly charged circumstances, the shaman would say, well, what were you thinking beforehand? And how has your life changed afterwards? How has your spirituality changed? How has your dream life changed? These are the questions that fascinate me in the context of the UFO thing. I'm certainly interested in the size and the direction and what the craft look like and all that. But I'm sort of stepping outside the bounds of what would be called ufology and into the consciousness aspect of what may or may not be taking place.
How do you balance, and you've talked a little bit about this idea that I appreciate where you come. I've heard you say before that I'm a folklorist, because you're kind of collecting these stories, or you're an anthropologist, another way of looking at it. I just interviewed Dr. Jack Hunter, who publishes this really cool journal called Parapsychology, and he's into this idea that we need to look at kind of multiple paradigms, multiple realities, multiple ontological ontologies. So where do you come down on that? Because one of the things I guess I was going to poke at you is sometimes you go, hey man, I'm just doing my folklorist thing over here. I'm not doing science. I'm not doing research. And it's like, to me, it's like, you could really turn it around and saying you're doing something closer to science research that is going to move the ball forward than somebody who's data mining a MUFON database about the size of craft or how many prongs were on the bottom of it or something like that, which your investigation calls into question how we would even begin to understand the reality of that. So what do you think about all that?
Woody Guthrie, rode the trains, and he was a hobo, and he wrote songs about hobos, and now I think our entire mystique about hobos in the 1930s is all like framed around, the stories he told in that way. And I feel like, more like Woody Guthrie than I do a scientist. It's funny, I'm getting ready to do a talk at a symposium, a scientific symposium. It's called, it's got science right in the title, and all these scientists are showing up, and they want me to talk. And I have to, I had to write the abstract, and I basically in the abstract had to say, I'm not really a scientist. So I know what you're saying, and I'm very cautious to jump to any conclusions. But as far as the research that I'm doing, I'm trying to be as honest as I can in the stories that I'm collecting. If people say something outrageously strange, all I can say is that's what the person told me, right? So I had a woman say an owl landed outside her window, a blue beam came down from outer space, hit the owl on the top of the head, it shot out of the owl's eyes and into her third eye. And she had this mystical experience because of it.
See, but here, I guess what I'm saying is you're a cool guy, so you'd never do this. But what if you went to the science conference and said, you guys aren't close to doing science on any of this stuff, aren't close. You're the polar opposite of science. If you want to look at science, here's your best chance. Go dive into these experiences. Go take the shamanic approach balanced with the screen memory approach. What if you just went out there and said, I'm the scientist, none of you guys are scientists?
I wouldn't say none of you guys are scientists. What I would say is this has to be explored in a completely different way. Right. So one of those things, and I do this in my talk, and I like doing it, and people I've gotten, in my face about it. It's like, what are you talking about? So this happened, and this was a real thing. I'm explaining something that really happened. It happened to me. So you buy your book on, you can buy a book on a UFO book, and you get it on an ebook, and you get it on Kindle, right? So right away, I get on my iPad. I can search it. I can search for the single word, and the word I want is owl. So the word owl shows up, but it's in the middle of other words, in bowl and stuff like that. But it's also in knowledge, and you get a book on a book by John Mack, and it's just full of the word knowledge. So you got to I got to get past knowledge. I want to get to owl. Knowledge. Knowledge. It's getting in my way, and that was like an epiphany for me. Knowledge was getting in my way. If I was going to proceed down this thing, I had to just sweep aside knowledge and follow something very intuitive. And because if I was stuck with logic, if I was stuck with pragmatic reasoning, I would say this owl thing is ridiculous. I had to do that too for my own experience, right? I had to say, yes, I did see aliens in my backyard, because I spent decades saying, no, that was a dream. I no longer think it's a dream. And I had to get past that linear brick wall, literal brick wall of pragmatic thought, and get into something more intuitive and more heart-based, as corny as that sounds. So this books, they're kind of mushy. I mean, I get kind of touchy-feely in those books, and I did not expect that as I pressed forward. But that was me releasing and shedding that. I mean, obviously, you got to write a clean sentence. You got to put the commas where they're supposed to go, but you also need to just dive in and trust that these things that there's a story there.
Well, I think your willingness to be vulnerable in that way is a real strength of the books, and it connects with so many people, obviously. So, my fourth truth bump here is this idea of unsiloed. And I wanted to pull you in some directions that you kind of touch on, but don't maybe talk on all the time. And I have a clip from your buddy, Rich Dolan, talking with Gordon White, an excellent show that they recorded on what might be a replacement for the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Let me play this clip and then see what you might think about it.
Arguing. So I don't think the ultra-terrestrial, just as an example of non-ETH perspective, I don't think it's aged that well. But I think an updated ETH needs to, and using some of LA's stuff, because the other thing that frustrates me about the ETH, non-ETH is people selectively read Valet. Like, he does say we're absolutely talking about a technology here. Like, this isn't just, like, you can't just say it's all, it's all fairies.
No, exactly. I would say, a fresh ETH needs to incorporate a few things. Like, so you'd want to incorporate some of the sciences. I mean, current knowledge in astronomy and, let's say, exoplanetary studies. It should incorporate under our current knowledge of energy and propulsion and automation and AI and computing. And it also, I think, should incorporate the experiences of people who've encountered these intelligences, including what we call experiencers or abductions. But my own take on it is that, my extraterrestrial hypothesis is that whoever they are, they've come here, they've been here for a long time. They're unbelievably advanced, beyond quantum computing, beyond what we would call the singularity in AI. I assume that they've had total genetic mastery of some version of organic printing and virtual reality creation. And so, I mean, and that's just the beginning.
That's just the beginning. That's a lot to take in. Let's talk about that a little bit. And in particular, I want to tie it back to what we were just talking about in terms of your book, in your work, and your desire and willingness to go shamanic, if you can say that. And at the same time, our need to kind of pull it back. I like the way that Gordon and Richard are talking about it here is, hey, there's a technology component that's undeniable here, and it seems to have a lot of overlap with this shamanic extended consciousness stuff. Let's chat about that for a minute and how you pull that apart.
I mean, these experiences are so utterly bizarre, right? I mean, they're in one sense, are they bizarre on purpose, forcing us to pay attention, that they're so weird. I mean, the pancake story. What's the fellow who had the pancakes back in Wisconsin? That's just, it doesn't get any weirder than that. And
so he goes on the ship and they give him pancakes.
They make pancakes on a little griddle, and then they actually so nobody's going to make that up, right? So so first of all, I don't care, right? On one level, I don't care whether they come from outer space. I don't care whether they come from a different dimension. I don't care if they're part of our collective unconscious. But how
can you not care? I mean,
as soon as I
care about,
as soon as I latch onto that, as soon as I latch onto one, then the other ones, then I ignore the other ones. I want it all to flood in. I want all these reports to flood in. I want the crazy ones to flood in. I want the ones that are illogical. So I want to wrestle with that stuff. So maybe there's a component to it that comes from another planet. Maybe there's a component that is a reflection of our own inner psyche. Maybe there's a component that there's a deeper layer of reality, and they're in another layer, and they can peer into our reality. This is all I can do is speculate. I say it very early on in the first one, I'm a disciple of the story. I love the stories. So if someone tells a story and that just points to, oh, it's a metal spaceship that landed in the road, that's how I tell the story. That's how I retell the story. If someone tells a story that's like, oh, I was transported into this mystical realm, and I had this out-of-body experience where I communed with God, then that's how I tell the story. So, or that's the story they've told me, and that's how so I don't want to get locked down into that. But yes, I can listen, I can pay attention, I can wrap my head around all the different modalities of what it might be. And I just want to be cautious not to, I mean, there's a lot of bathwater and there's multiple babies in there. So
I think that's great. And I think that's somewhat of a lead into my fifth and final truth bump, if you will, that I wanted to kind of hit you with. And it's Ray Hernandez, who we were just chatting a little bit before the show. I've known Ray for a long time, like you. I mean, he contacted me really early on in the skeptical thing when he was first getting started. Like, I was one of the first people he contacted and said, "Hey, I've had this really strange experience. Where do I go?" kind of thing. And I was like, "Wow, I don't know. I mean, not really my thing. Let me try and help you." And then I became involved in this free organization that he became a part of. And then you contacted him. He's done fantastic work with this. And the question that he draws right to the center of the stage is this one that we were just wrestling with, and that is contacting what? What exactly are we contacting? And in this presentation, Ray talks about the really dramatic parallels between UFO contact / alien contact experiences and this near-death experience contact experience that we are really comfortable with at this point, with saying, okay, that's a medical reality. Heart surgeons see that and patients recount that, even if they're under heavy anesthesia, even if they're pronounced dead and are in the morgue, or even if they're blind from birth and then they, for the first and only time in their life, are able to see during the near-death experience. So, Ray did an awesome work of saying, okay, what do those two things look like? Are these two things similar in any way? And here's what he says.
The website is experiencer.org. The title of my presentation today is A Comparative Analysis of UFO-related contact with non-human intelligence, near-death experiences, and out-of-body experiences, consciousness and contact towards the unification of the contact modalities. As I said,
and we can stop it right there because the title kind of gives the whole story away. Let's dive right back into where we left off on the point before. Is what are we contacting here?
Well, that's, so it's funny because the original title of the second book was going to be Stories from Messengers, Owls, UFOs, and Consciousness. And I read through the book, and that was the title of it. And I was like, I don't really mention consciousness. I don't really use the term consciousness in the book. I use it a couple times, but I don't really say that. I don't really explore consciousness. What I do explore, and I changed the title of the book, it's now called Owls, UFOs, and a Deeper Reality. I do explore this realm of a deeper reality that surrounds us. Now, so that's what I'm concerned with, like all these things, right? So people have these powerful experiences. I mean, a UFO experience can be powerful, can be life-changing. An owl sighting. I have people who've turned back from suicide because an owl presented itself to them. I have synchronicities. A powerful synchronicity can change someone's life. These are transformative experience. Death is the ultimate transformation, right? So that owls are the totem of death all across the world. Doesn't matter where you are. You go to Ireland, you go to Norway, you go to Tierra del Fuego, you go to Russia. Their owl is symbolic of death. So loosen that back, take 2 steps back. To me, the owl is this totem of the transformational process. So people see a UFO, they are transformed. Someone sees a UFO, they're never, if you see one, and then you see, the guy, the scientist on the point counterpoint kind of documentary say, well, there's no such thing as UFOs. That guy is wrong because I've had the direct experience of seeing a flying craft in the sky that defies all boundaries. I know that guy is wrong. I know what I saw. So all of a sudden I'm outside the boundaries of the society, the norms, because of my direct experience. I know that the skeptics drumbeat of there's no such thing as UFOs is wrong. And but that same thing can happen with with an out-of-body experience, with a near-death experience, with a shamanic initiation, with a deep state of meditation. So what I'm more concerned about, and Ray Hernandez speaks to this beautifully, and he actually came out with his report where he that's the logo that was back there is this wheel, and all these hubs are pointing to this core thing. And I said, here's all these things. I listed them, and he came up with pretty much the exact same list. In the first book, I listed these things: synchronicity, shamanic initiation, meditation, psychedelic, so, and I can't remember, like, he came up with about 7, I came up with about 7, and they match pretty well. And he took it one step further. He said, at the center of this hub is consciousness.
But hold on, because that kind of loses its meaning in a way. The consciousness is really the whole thing.
That's a tough one to wrap your mind around. That's even
it's so misunderstood in terms of just back to the kind of skeptical mainstream science as we know it. I mean, is a completely off the rails with consciousness. I mean, they're still in this kind of biological robot meaningless universe epiphenomenon of the brain kind of thing, which is a road completely to nowhere. So it's like consciousness can get really confusing. And then consciousness from a deeply spiritual standpoint is, some people are saying, kind of an idealism. There's only consciousness, and all the stuff that you're playing with right here and examining and mulling over is just another kind of instantiation of consciousness in a different form. And don't get too hung up about it. Just like don't get too hung up about your past life experience or any of the rest of that. It all flows back into one. So consciousness doesn't get us any closer. What I wrestle with from Ray's work is that we feel like, maybe I feel like, we have our feet on the ground with near-death experience science, because we can go look at the peer-reviewed near-death experience science, and we can say, gosh darn it, that guy was dead by every means we can measure it. He was outside his body looking down. There's no way that can happen. And now he starts having all these experiences. And so then for someone like Ray and the Free Organization to come along and say, here's the problem, guys. The near-death experience, when we start really asking people what it was like, and we start asking people from the abductee experience what it was really like, and we start asking them, well, was there this spiritual component of it? And did you feel a heightened sense of awareness? Did you feel an improved ability to cope? All these things start matching up in a way that challenges all our models. I mean, it's okay. And actually, it doesn't challenge too much the shamanic model. That kind of stays intact. But it does challenge, the Rich Dolan, Gordon White interview. Like, hey, man, these guys really got the technology down, and they understand, AI, and they understand genetic printing, and they understand the rest of this. It's like, it kind of blows that away in a way that we can't resolve it back to, if these people are having near-death experiences and meeting God, then I don't think God cares too much, if there is such a thing, but we have to fill in that blank. I don't think God cares about genetic printing and AI and this, unless you want to go that whole way and say, that's what God is. But it gets to the crux of that issue in a way that I really want to kind of bring that to a point without, kind of jumping back to, well, it could be anything kind of thing.
Well, you've asked the big question, right? That they stood around in togas and, why are we here? What's the meaning of life? And debated these things back in ancient Greece, and we're still struggling with those same questions. Like why? That's my sense, is that this is any thinking person, and I'm going to be bold here. I mean, there's 700 pages of owl stuff. You put one book on top of another, it's about 700 pages you got to wade through, and I still don't have a good conclusion. But what I can say is these issues bring up the big question. They bring up, why are we here? What does it mean? Where are we going? And I didn't expect that going into this. So you asked the big, big, big question, how does this relate to, I would take a step back and avoid the word consciousness and say the human experience. And I mean the essence of what it means to be a noble human trying to do something good. And I think that the people who have had, there's a researcher, she used the term, the trauma of enlightenment.
Yes.
People come back from a near-death experience. That's the trauma of enlightenment. So I'm not saying I'm enlightened, but I am saying I have had to struggle with the trauma, and it has forced me, like something crumbled. Some other part of me had to crumble away, and this other part had to rise up and fill that empty space. And I feel that this other part is better than the husk that fell away. And
okay,
maybe
but I want to push this one step further, because I haven't heard you talk about this, and this is very, very interesting to me. Speculation on your part. What do you, if we make these kind of false dichotomies and we say the near-death experience is a spiritual experience, and we extend that to say that means by God it's God experience, right? And then, so we're just going to draw these really kind of magic marker kind of lines that are fake, and then we go over to the UFO experience and we go, David Jacobs, hey baby, this is abduction, and the clothes are different and you didn't consent to this and all the rest of this. But what happens when we peer into that, like Ray Hernandez has done, and the data starts aligning, and we have to deal with the reality that there's a technology there, but the technology is approaching the spiritual. That's a big one. I know you're wrestling with it, because we're all wrestling with it. How do you resolve that? What are the implications of that for you personally right now? Where do you sit?
You asked me earlier, what's my responsibility in all this? So my responsibility in all this is to proceed forward with as much honesty and integrity. Like when there was a couple typos and a couple people got misquoted. It broke my heart in the book, right? So that's just me as a person feeling bad. These stories, I care deeply about these stories, these owl and UFO stories. How does that transfer? So people are having, I use the term magical. I got no problem with saying it's a magical experience. People had a magic experience, because I can't say whether it was a psychic experience or whether it was done through technology. Certain things, sure, blue beam shot from outer space goes into the owl, comes out of the owl's eyes and zaps someone. That could be technology, or that could be a mystical, metaphoric. I can't get stuck on the meta labels. I'm much more nuanced, and I'm my goal and my hope and what rarely floats my boat, let's say, is talking to these folks. You talk to UFO abductees on the phone, they're going to cry. That's how many phone calls have I had where people sob? It's normal, right? People are unloading, people are gushing, people are struggling with this. They have, I say the deeper reality. I'm consciousness. I can't wrap my mind around consciousness. I can better wrap my mind around the term deeper reality. Wherever we are, we're in this place. Wherever they are, the little spirit gnomes that control the owls, or the flying saucer that's parked in some sort of mystical third dimension or fifth dimension, right? So they can peer in and influence us with these wild experiences. And that was the point of the second book, was to tell these stories in their totality. And people have a hard time with this. Now I'm sort of spinning all over the map and kind of riffing here, and rein me back in, because I may not get to the answer you want. But my sense is that we're dealing with a human experience that has been here throughout the ages, and that there's owl mythology in place, and that mythology has been there right since we crawled out of the caves. It's with us now. We're now materialists, and we have scientists that say, oh no, it doesn't work like that, even though the people who are having these experiences are basically having the same experiences, in my opinion, that created this ancient mythology. So what we're dealing with in this owl stuff, and I'll say the UFO stuff, and on the out-of-body experience, and all this stuff is nothing new. It's been happening all throughout human history, and it is the core of our it's imbued in us somehow, like a meta archetype in us.
Okay, our guest again has been Mike Clelland. Do check out his great books. The first one, The Messengers, I have up on the screen if you're watching the YouTube. The second one, Stories from the Messengers. Mike, take a minute and tell folks about those two books, what the differences are, and also about what else is going on with you. You do some speaking and engagements, and you do have, think you're getting back into, you're starting to fire up the old blog as well. So tell folks about all that stuff.
So the first book was published a couple years ago, a little over 2 years ago, and that book was the culmination of about, it's hard to really pin it down, but getting close to 10 years of research on the owl thing, probably around 9 years of research on the owl thing. And so I argue in that book that there's a connection between UFOs and owls. Whether I'm successful or not, you read the book and you feel by the end, I don't know whether I'll convince you or not. The second book was and I'll say I was a much calmer person. I was tense before I started to write that book. And in the act of writing it was a 5-year process of self-therapy. And the second book was, I felt bad because to make my point, I had to eliminate and nix and kind of boil down people's stories to just a few sentences or just a few paragraphs, where these stories were epic. These were novels waiting to be written. So the second book is 19 chapters. Each chapter is a very detailed story that allows these stories to be told in what I consider a much more complete form. I needed to write that book because it broke my heart that I had to edit so much out in the first book. So so the second book reads like a book of short stories. And if you want to get a hold of me, you can Google, as you said earlier, UFOs, owls. I'm the first thing that comes up. You can go to my website. I've got a couple different websites. Some of them are just book promotion type things. But my main blog is hiddenexperience.blogspot.com. And I have been, you can dig through there. It's getting on 10 years of stuff that's in there, and there's a lot in there. But I also did, for 6 years, I was very dedicated to doing a podcast. I interviewed a lot of folks, and those are all archived there. And then and I try to answer everyone's email. I used to get about 1 email a day. Now it's about 3 a day. And that's been, if I don't get back to you right away, you have my permission to bug me and pester me.
It's been absolutely awesome reconnecting with you and having you on, and we'll just have to stay in better touch. It's been too many years. You've made such a tremendous contribution here, and like we said, we don't know how or why, but you're the owl guy.
Oh, I'm certainly the owl guy at this point, and I take that responsibility very seriously.
Awesome, Mike. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
So thanks for watching this video. And if it wasn't really a video, but just an audio stored as a video, I apologize. But there's more videos out there as well. But please check out the Skeptico website. You can see it here. We cover a lot of different stuff you might be interested in relating to controversial science and spirituality. A lot of shows up there, over 350 of them or so, all free, all available for download. So do check it out.